In the shadowed corners of New Jersey, where the trees grow tall and the wind whispers through the leaves, lies the remnants of a place where madness once reigned supreme. It's a place that, even now, after so many years of abandonment, refuses to let go of its tormented past. A place known as the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. The building stands like a monument to suffering, its crumbling walls and broken windows silently testifying to the horrors that unfolded within. But the real terror of Trenton is not just in its decaying structure, but in the memories that cling to it, memories of a man whose name still sends shivers down the spines of those who dare speak it. Dr. Henry Cotton. Dr. Cotton was no ordinary physician. His eyes burned with a fanatical light and his mind was consumed by a singular belief. That insanity was caused by infections hidden deep within the body. But unlike others, who might have sought to cure the mind through gentle means, Cotton's methods were nothing short of barbaric. He believed that to cure his patients, he must cut out the infection, literally. It began with the teeth. Patients, terrified and trembling, were strapped to cold metal chairs, their mouths pried open as Dr. Cotton wielded his instruments with the precision of a madman. Tooth by tooth, he would extract them, convinced that he was driving out the demons of madness. But when teeth alone didn't suffice, he moved on to more drastic measures. Tonsils were removed, stomachs cut open, intestines excised, all in the name of a cure that never came. The screams of the patients echoed through the halls, desperate cries for mercy that fell on deaf ears. For Dr. Cotton, these were not men and women in need of compassion. They were riddled with infection, and he was their savior, no matter the cost. But as the bodies piled up, as more and more patients succumbed to his brutal treatments, the hospital began to change. The once sterile corridors became saturated with a dark energy, something beyond the realm of the living. Shadows moved where no light could cast them, and cold spots chilled the bones of those who dared to walk the halls alone. It is said that the dead do not rest easily at Trenton, and the spirits of Cotton's victims are still very much alive in the darkest recesses of the hospital. Visitors, those brave or foolish enough to explore the abandoned asylum, have reported hearing the sounds of footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the faint cries of pain, and whispers that seem to come from the very walls themselves. One particular room is said to be the most haunted of all, the operating theater where Dr. Cotton performed his most gruesome surgeries. Those who enter often describe a sense of suffocation, as if the air itself is thick with despair. Shadows flit across the walls, and some claim to have seen the ghostly figure of Dr. Cotton himself, his white coat stained with the blood of his patients, his eyes still gleaming with that maniacal light. But the most terrifying encounters are with the spirits of the patients themselves. They are not at peace, and they do not rest. Some speak of a woman in a tattered hospital gown who wanders the halls, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. Others have seen a young boy, no more than 8 or 9, who sits in a corner, clutching his stomach as if in pain. His eyes are hollow, his face pale, and when he looks at you, you feel as though he's staring straight into your soul. And then there are the voices, those terrible, disembodied voices that echo through the halls at night. They call out in pain, in anger, in despair. Some say they're begging for help. Others think they're cursing the living. But all agree on one thing. They are the voices of the damned, trapped forever within the walls of Trenton. There are those who say that Dr. Cotton's spirit is still there too, not as a ghost but as a malignant force, a dark presence that feeds on the fear and suffering that permeates the asylum. They say that if you stand in the operating theater at night, you can hear him whispering in the dark, his voice low and menacing, promising that he will cure you, just as he cured all the others. So, if you ever find yourself near the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, if you feel a chill in the air, or hear a distant cry carried on the wind, remember the horrors that took place within those walls. And whatever you do, don't venture inside. For once you cross the threshold, you may find that the spirits of Trenton have no intention of letting you leave. In the heart of Massachusetts, atop a windswept hill, there once stood a place where shadows whispered and madness reigned, a place known as the Danvers State Hospital. It was a foreboding structure, built in 1878, with towering spires and dark looming windows that seemed to gaze out over the town below like the hollow eyes of a skull. They called it an asylum, a sanctuary for the mentally ill, but it was anything but. Those who entered its walls seldom left with their sanity intact, if they left at all. The asylum was designed to house just over 600 patients, but by the early 20th century, its narrow halls and claustrophobic rooms were crammed with more than 2,000 souls, each one tormented by their own inner demons. The staff, overwhelmed and outnumbered, resorted to barbaric treatments to maintain order, treatments that would send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened of men. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, and lobotomies were common practice, each one more horrifying than the last. The screams of patients echoed through the stone corridors day and night, a symphony of suffering that never ceased. But it wasn't just the living who suffered within those walls. No, something far more sinister lurked in the shadows of Danvers, something that fed on the despair, the pain, and the madness that saturated the very air. The patients could sense it, even if they couldn't understand it. They spoke in hushed tones of dark figures that moved just out of sight, of voices that whispered terrible things in the dead of night, and of cold, clammy hands that brushed against their skin when no one else was near. One of the most notorious stories to emerge from Danvers involves a young woman named Emily. She was just 23 when she was committed, having been declared insane after a series of violent outbursts that left her family in fear for their lives. The doctors at Danvers believed they could cure her, but Emily had no desire to be cured. She had seen things, terrible things, in her dreams. Visions of a dark figure with hollow eyes and a mouth full of sharp, broken teeth. It haunted her every waking moment, driving her to madness. And now, trapped within the asylum's stone walls, she felt its presence more strongly than ever. The doctors subjected Emily to all manner of treatments, but nothing worked. She grew more and more agitated, her screams growing louder, more desperate. And then, one cold winter's night, she vanished. The nurses found her bed empty, the restraints that had held her torn to shreds. They searched the asylum from top to bottom, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. The staff tried to cover up Emily's disappearance, but the patients knew the truth. They whispered of how they had seen her, or something that looked like her, wandering the halls in the dead of night. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her skin pale and translucent, and always, just behind her, they saw the dark figure, the one she had spoken of so often, now standing beside her, its broken teeth bared in a twisted grin. The sightings continued for weeks, each one more terrifying than the last. And then, one night, the asylum was rocked by an ear-splitting scream, a scream that seemed to come from every corner of the building at once. The staff rushed to the source, but when they arrived, they found nothing but darkness and silence. Emily was never seen again, but the patients knew she hadn't left. She was still there, trapped within the asylum's walls, doomed to wander its halls for all eternity, with the dark figure always at her side. The years passed, and the asylum slowly fell into disrepair. The patients were moved to other facilities, the staff dispersed, and Danvers was left to rot. But the darkness that had taken root there never left. Urban explorers who dared to venture into the crumbling ruins spoke of eerie whispers, cold spots, and shadowy figures that seemed to move just out of sight. Some claimed to have seen a young woman, her eyes wide and hollow, standing in the shadows, with a dark figure looming just behind her. They say that the land where Danvers once stood is cursed, that the spirits of the tortured souls who perished there still linger, trapped between this world and the next. And if you're brave or foolish enough to visit the site on a cold, moonless night, you might just hear the echoes of their suffering, carried on the wind like a mournful wail. And if you listen closely, you might hear something else. A low, guttural growl like the sound of broken teeth grinding together in the dark. It was a moonless night, the kind where the darkness seems to stretch on forever, swallowing everything in its path. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of forgotten memories and silent screams. They said the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was a place where the living and the dead mingled, where the walls whispered tales of madness and sorrow. And tonight, I was about to find out if the stories were true. I approached the asylum, its towering Gothic facade looming over me like a monstrous guardian of the night. The building stood there, silent and still, yet I could feel it watching me, its many eyes, the shattered windows, gazing into my soul. As I stepped closer, the rusted gates groaned open as if welcoming me into its cold embrace. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, and a shiver crept down my spine. I had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? Tales of tortured souls, of the insane and the desperate, of those who never left. But hearing the stories and standing in the very place where they unfolded are two very different things. I walked through the decaying halls, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The walls were cracked, peeling, and stained with the passage of time, yet I could almost hear the murmurs of the past, as if the very stones were eager to share their secrets. The farther I ventured, the more the atmosphere thickened, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I wasn't alone here. Something was watching, waiting. I turned a corner, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted in the air, and I felt a presence, something unseen, something dark. It was then that I heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. A voice, weak and desperate, pleading for help. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear myself away. The voice grew louder, clearer, as if it were right next to me, though the hallway was empty. "Help me." The words hung in the air, a soft, agonized plea. I turned slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There, in the shadows, I saw a figure, barely more than a silhouette. It was a woman, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. She was dressed in an old, tattered hospital gown, her long hair matted and wild, obscuring her face. But I could feel her eyes on me, burning with a desperation that was almost tangible. She didn't move, didn't speak again, but I could feel her pain, her sorrow, as if it were my own. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, a palpable sense of dread that wrapped around me like a cold, wet blanket. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The hallway was empty once more, but the chill lingered, seeping into my bones. I forced myself to move, to continue down the corridor. I needed to see more, to understand what had happened here, what had left such a scar on this place. The whispers followed me, faint and indistinct, as if the walls themselves were alive with the voices of the dead. I found myself standing before a large door, its surface scratched and scarred, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Above it, a faded sign read, "Ward C." My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and for a moment I hesitated. Something deep inside me screamed that this was a mistake, that whatever lay beyond that door was not meant to be disturbed. But I had come this far. There was no turning back. The door creaked open, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The stench of mildew and decay was overpowering, and the air was thick with dust. Beds lined the walls, their metal frames rusted, the mattresses stained and torn, and in each bed, something lay. At first I thought they were mannequins, placed there as some macabre joke. But as I stepped closer, I saw the truth. They were bodies, decayed, skeletal, yet somehow still intact. Their eyes, those that still had them, were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if trapped in an eternal, silent scream. I felt bile rise in my throat and turned away, only to come face to face with another figure. This one was different from the others, more solid, more real. He was tall, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He wore a doctor's coat, stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low and raspy, filled with an unnatural calm. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my mind blank with terror. "You shouldn't be here," he continued, stepping closer. His eyes bore into mine, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or regret. "They're not done. They're never done." He reached out, his hand cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. "You need to leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible now, a breath of air in the stillness. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a start that they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the bodies in the beds. Their mouths moved, their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, turned to me, and they spoke in unison, their voices a terrible chorus of despair. "Help us! Help us!" I staggered back, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The doctor watched me, his expression unreadable, his eyes following my every move. And then, as if the very shadows themselves had come to life, the room began to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the darkness swallowing the last remnants of light. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the whispers chasing after me like a relentless tide. The asylum seemed to shift and twist around me, its labyrinthine corridors leading me deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. The sense of dread grew stronger with every step, and I could feel them, the spirits of the dead, the tortured souls trapped within these walls, closing in on me. I reached the main door and flung it open, stumbling out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I gasped, my breath misting in the frigid air. I looked back at the asylum, its dark silhouette towering against the night sky, and I knew I would never return. The things I had seen, the horrors I had felt, were more than any person should bear. As I left, the whispers faded into the night, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors that still haunted the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out, something unseen, something dark. The asylum had claimed countless lives, and now I feared it had marked me as well. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands atop a lonely hill in Louisville, Kentucky, its silhouette cutting a stark figure against the night sky. The building, once a beacon of hope for those suffering from tuberculosis, now sits abandoned, its decaying walls holding on to the memories of countless souls who met their end within its cold embrace. They say the wind never truly stops howling around Waverly Hills. It whispers secrets, carries the faint echoes of desperate cries, and, if you listen closely, you might even hear the footsteps of those who have never left. The year was 1928, a time when tuberculosis, then known as the White Plague, ravaged the country. Waverly Hills was a last resort for those afflicted, a place where the dying came to grasp at their final breaths. The sanatorium was equipped with everything needed to care for the patients, but it was not enough. The disease spread like wildfire, and the death toll rose each day. Within those walls, there was a place that became the stuff of nightmares, Room 502. The 5th floor of Waverly Hills was reserved for the most hopeless cases, those who had lost their minds to the disease or the despair that came with it. But Room 502 had a darker history. A nurse, young and full of hope, had been assigned to Room 502. Her name was Mary, and she had come to Waverly Hills with dreams of healing the sick and comforting the dying. But the horrors she witnessed soon began to wear on her soul. Each day she watched as patients succumbed to the relentless grip of tuberculosis. Each night she heard their screams, saw their fevered eyes pleading for relief that would never come. The whispers began soon after Mary was assigned to the 5th floor. The other nurses noticed the changes in her, how she seemed to carry the weight of the entire sanatorium on her shoulders, how her once bright eyes grew dull with each passing day. They spoke of strange things happening in room 502, lights flickering with no explanation, cold drafts sweeping through the room, and shadows that moved on their own. Then, one moonless night, Mary was found dead in room 502. They say she hanged herself from a light fixture, her body swaying gently in the stale air. The other nurses were the first to discover her, their screams echoing through the silent corridors. The sight was enough to chill the blood of even the most hardened among them. Mary's face was twisted in a final expression of terror, her eyes wide open, staring at something unseen, something that had driven her to take her own life. But Mary's death was not the end of the horrors in room 502. In the years that followed, patients and staff alike reported strange occurrences. The room seemed to hold on to the sadness, the fear, the despair that had consumed Mary. Those who entered room 502 felt a crushing weight on their chest, as if the very air was trying to suffocate them. Some claimed to hear Mary's voice, a soft, mournful whisper calling out for help. Others swore they saw her shadow, a fleeting figure in the corner of their eye, watching them, waiting for something they could never understand. The most chilling tale, however, comes from a night watchman who worked at Waverly Hills long after it was abandoned. The sanatorium had become a place of morbid curiosity, drawing in those who sought a thrill or a glimpse of the supernatural. The watchman, a skeptic by nature, dismissed the stories as nonsense, until the night he encountered her. It was a stormy evening, the kind where lightning splits the sky and thunder rattles the bones of the earth. The watchman was making his rounds, flashlight in hand, when he heard it, a soft, sorrowful weeping. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing through the empty halls. The sound led him to the 5th floor, to room 502. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, just as he expected, but the weeping continued, growing louder, more desperate. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, and then he saw her, a figure hanging from the ceiling, her body swaying gently, just as the stories had said. But this was no ordinary apparition. As the watchman stood frozen in terror, the figure slowly lifted its head. Her eyes, Mary's eyes, locked onto his, and in them, he saw a bottomless void of pain and suffering. Her mouth twisted into a silent scream, and the room grew unbearably cold. The watchman stumbled back, dropping his flashlight as the figure reached out towards him. He could feel the air grow thick, pressing against him, suffocating him. The weeping had turned into a cacophony of voices, all crying out, all begging for release. With a final burst of adrenaline, the watchman fled the room, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running until he was outside, the rain drenching him as he gasped for breath. When he finally gathered the courage to return, the room was empty once more, but the memory of that night never left him. Waverly Hills Sanatorium still stands today, a decaying monument to the suffering that took place within its walls. Room 502 remains the most feared part of the building, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is said to be thinnest. Those who dare to enter often leave with stories of their own, of cold hands brushing against them, of soft whispers in their ear, of a shadowy figure watching them from the corner of the room. And sometimes, if the night is dark enough and the wind howls just right, you might hear the faint sound of a rope creaking and the soft, sorrowful weeping of a nurse who was never able to leave. The night was darker than usual, as if the sky itself had swallowed all the stars. The wind howled through the broken windows of the Rolling Hills Asylum, its eerie whistle like a ghostly wail, echoing through the long abandoned halls. The building stood as a hulking reminder of a time when the unwanted and the forgotten were cast aside, left to rot within these walls. The Asylum, originally opened in 1827 as the Genesee County Poorhouse, had seen countless souls pass through its doors. It was a place where the poor, the mentally ill, and the unfortunate were sent to live out their days, often in misery. Over the years, the building became a labyrinth of sorrow, its walls absorbing the pain and despair of those who had been confined within. But there was one soul who never truly left. Roy was his name, though few remembered him now. Standing at an imposing 7 feet tall, Roy suffered from gigantism, a condition that made him an outcast even among the other inmates. With his massive frame and slow, deliberate movements, he was a gentle giant by nature, but the others feared him nonetheless. They whispered about him in the dark, spinning tales of his monstrous strength, of his unnatural height, and of the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. Roy had been brought to the asylum as a child, left there by parents who could not understand or care for him. He spent his entire life within those walls, wandering the halls with no one but the echoes of his own footsteps to keep him company. The other residents shunned him, and even the staff treated him as little more than a burden. His only solace was in the quiet corners of the asylum, where he could hide away from the cruel eyes of others, lost in his own world. Years passed, and the asylum became Roy's prison and his home. He grew older, his body weighed down by the constant pain of his condition, his spirit crushed by the relentless isolation, and then one day, he simply disappeared. Some say he died in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after years of suffering. Others whisper that he wandered off into the dark, endless corridors and was never seen again. But the truth is far more chilling. On a cold, moonless night, a nurse, new to the asylum and unaware of its dark history, had been making her rounds when she heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, the kind of footsteps that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. She froze, the sound of her own breath loud in the suffocating silence. The footsteps drew nearer, closer and closer, until they stopped just outside the door. She felt a presence, something massive and looming, just beyond the threshold. But when she gathered the courage to peek out into the hallway, there was nothing, only the long, empty corridor stretching out before her. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something standing just out of sight, lingered. She hurried through her duties, her hands trembling as she tried to shake off the dread that clung to her like a shroud. That night, as she lay in bed, the sound returned, the heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth just outside her door. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that it was all in her head. But then, she heard it, a low, mournful sigh, like the wind itself was weeping. The next morning, she found herself drawn to the old records room where she unearthed the story of Roy. As she read through the faded documents, the pieces began to fall into place. The height, the slow movements, the sense of overwhelming sadness. Roy had never left the asylum. His spirit, bound by the loneliness and suffering he had endured in life, still wandered the halls, searching for the peace he had been denied. From that day forward, the nurse was never the same. She began to see Roy everywhere, in the shadows that stretched too long across the floor, in the flicker of a light that shouldn't have been on, in the cold breath of air that brushed against her skin. She heard his sighs in the dead of night, felt his presence lingering just beyond her reach. The other staff began to notice the change in her, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at every sound, how she always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. And then one day she was gone. No one knew where she went, or why she left so suddenly. But those who remained in the asylum could feel it. The air had grown colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the very building was mourning her loss. The asylum eventually closed its doors, its walls left to crumble and decay. But the locals still speak of Roy, the gentle giant whose spirit never found peace. They say that on cold, moonless nights, you can still hear his footsteps echoing through the halls, searching for something, or someone, to ease his eternal loneliness. But be warned, if you hear those footsteps, don't look back, for Roy is still searching and he just might find you.